talking a little bit about Sfiras HaOmer. If you remember, we had mentioned two shitos in Rishonim. Most Rishonim, Taisus and Menachos, as well as others, take the position that Bisman Hazeh, Sfiras HaOmer is only midrabanan, because the Oraisa, it is triggered only when you actually bring the Korban HaOmer. And since Bisman Hazeh, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, we don't bring the Korban HaOmer, therefore there is no chiyuv of counting. And the chiyuv of counting is midrabanan, which is called Zecher LaMikdash, to remember what we did when we had a Beis HaMikdash. This is most Rishonim, that Sfira Bisman Hazeh is midrabanan. The exception to the Shita is the Shita HaRambam, who actually maintains that Sfiras HaOmer is Doraisa, because according to the Rambam, the trigger of the Chiyuv is not the Korban of the Omer, but it is the second day of Pesach, meaning intrinsically the second day of Pesach is Gorem, the obligation of counting the Omer, whether there is a Korban Omer or not. Okay, so that's relatively well understood. Is the Chiyuv of Svira totally on the Korban Omer, or is it totally on the actual day itself? But then I had mentioned the third Shita, which is the Shita of Rabbeinu Yerucham, who was a Talmud of the Rosh, and Rabbeinu Yerucham is machalek between the mitzvah of counting weeks and the mitzvah of counting days, because the Gemara itself says, as we do in our own counting, that there's a chiyuv to count the days of the Omer, and there's a chiyuv to count the weeks of the Omer. Now remember, counting weeks in terms of the chiyuv is not the way we do it. In other words, the chiyuv of counting weeks is, at the end of week 1, you say 7 days, that is 1 week. And then at the end of week 2, 14 days, that is 2 weeks, meaning the chiyuv of weeks actually does not mean that you got to count the weeks in the middle of a week. So for example, today is what, the 22nd of the Omer, right? So we counted last night 3 weeks and 1 day. That is only mitam minhag. In other words, under the chiyuv of counting weeks, it is only day 7, I count 1 week, day 14, I count 2 weeks, and in the middle I just count the days, I would just say day 22. The minhag is that every single day we also mention the weeks. But nevertheless, in terms of chiyuvim, there is a chiyuv to count days and a chiyuv to count weeks. So Zakt Rabbeinu Yerucham, the chiyuv to count weeks is only drabanan zecher lemikdash, because the oraisa, that depends on the korban ha'omer. But the chiyuv to count days, Zakt Rabbeinu Yerucham, is a chiyuv de oraisa. So essentially, he follows the Rambam's opinion regarding the counting of days, and he follows Tosas's opinion regarding the counting of weeks. And I had mentioned that this might be the source of the Nusach Sfarad that many Sfardim have, that they position the word Omer after the day. So they'll say Hayom Shnayim V'Yesrim Yom Ba'Omer, or La Omer, that's a separate thing. Today is the 22nd day of the Omer, Shehem Shlosha Shvuos, that is 3 weeks V'Yom Echad. They put the word Ba'Omer after the days and not after the final tally of the weeks. And the svara of that might be that if you follow Rabbeinu Yerucham, that the counting of days is da'oraisa, perhaps, I'm just speculating, I did not see this as a reason, perhaps we want to put the word Omer adjacent to the Torah part of the commandment. But the question that we literally broke off at the very end of the Shiur was, what logic is it to differentiate between days and weeks? I mean, either you tell me Sfira is totally on Korban Omer, so everything Bisman Hazeh is Zecher LaMikdash, or you tell me Sfira is not totally on Korban Omer, so everything today would be Doraisa. Right? That's the Machlokas Tosfos and the Rambam. But Mehechi Tesi, from where would you get any type of supposition that there ought to be any distinction between days and weeks? So the truth of the matter is, there are actually two mahalchim for Rabbeinu Yerucham. Both can be true at the same time. One is a close reading of a pasuk, and the other is a potential svara. So you actually have two different ways Rabbeinu Yerucham can be explained. And again, they're not contradictory because we could derive something from a pasuk and then we can give a svara for it as well. Let's look at the pasuk of Sfiras HaOmer. The pasuk of Sfiras HaOmer is coming up in the Torah pretty soon. It's the Shabbos after next Shabbos, 2 Shabboses from now. And some people say this pasuk every day, right, before Sfira. If you say Hineni Muchan U'Mezuman, right? Okay, in the Yeshiva they don't say it, but okay. We can talk about that too. But what does the pasuk say? Usvartem lachem, you shall count mimacharas haShabbos, from the day after Shabbos. Now we know Shabbos in that pasuk means the Yom Tov of Pesach. In other words, right? Miyom haviachem esomer hatnufa, from the day that you bring the barley offering of the Omer. Sheva Shabbosais Tamimais Tihiyana, 7 complete weeks. And at that point in the pasuk you have an esnachta. Right, an esnachta looks like a wishbone, but in the trup, an esnachta is a semicolon. It actually breaks up a pasuk into 2 halves. Okay, so esnachta within a pasuk is actually the major break. All tamim are either connectors or separators. Esnachta is a major separation. By the way, as a little aside, nothing to do with our topic whatsoever, the taimim, the trup, the various notes that mark how you read a verse, for 3 books in Nach, Iyov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, which is abbreviated MS, the trup has a totally different function. So an esnachta in Tehillim is actually not a break. It's very, very strange. The meanings that apply to Torah and Nevi'im and most of Ksuvim do not apply to Sifrei Emes. So although it is true that an esnachta is a semicolon, it is a major break, that is not true for Sifrei Emes. Okay, but putting that aside, note the esnachta. Usvartem lachem mimacharas haShabbos, miyom haviachem es omer hatnufa, Sheva Shabbosais Tivimos Tiyena Esnachta. Then it says, Ad mimacharas haShabbos hashviyis, until the day after the 7th week, Tisbaru chamishim yom, you shall count 50 days, meaning 49 days, and the 50th day is the Yom Tov. Now note that the pasuk is divided into 2 halves. The first half of the pasuk is the mitzvah to count weeks. Sheva Shabbosos Tamimos Tiyena. The second half of the pasuk is the mitzvah to count days. Tisbaru Chamishim Yom. The mitzvah of weeks is separated from the mitzvah of days by an esnachta, semicolon. Now, the words, you start counting, miyom haviachem es omer hatnufa, you start counting from the bringing of the omer, appears in the first half of the pasuk, which is Sheva Shabbosais Timimos Tiyena, counting the weeks. The second part of the pasuk, Tisbru Chamishim Yom, does not have the modifier Miyom Haviachem. Although without an esnachta, you could have read Miyom Haviachem es Omer Nufa is going on everything in the pasuk. But the esnachta creates a break between the first half of the pasuk and the second half of the pasuk. Wow! Once you hear this, Rabbeinu Yerucham is so eminently logical. The counting of the weeks is midrabanan bisman hazeh, because the Torah connects it to miyom haviachem es omer hatnufa. But the counting of the days, which is separated from miyom haviachem es omer hatnufa, is going to be a standalone mitzvah. And therefore, says Rabbeinu Yerucham, the counting of the days is da'oraisa, even bisman hazeh. The counting of the weeks is only a zecher lamikdash. Now, Rabbeinu Yerucham, however, this pshat in Rabbeinu Yerucham is assuming something. I had said it, but the truth is, it's really an assumption. That both the mitzvah of weeks and the mitzvah of days are derived from the same pasuk. And before the Asnachta, the Sheva Shabbosais Timimos Tiyena is the mitzvah of counting weeks. And after the Asnachta, Tisbru Chamishim Yaim is the mitzvah of counting days. And therefore we have the week mitzvah, we have the days mitzvah, and the reference to starting from the Omer offering only appears in the week's mitzvah and not in the day's mitzvah. This is the assumption of what I've been saying to explain Rabbeinu Yerucham. But the truth of the matter is, many Rishonim, of course Rabbeinu Yerucham could argue with Rishonim, he was a Rishon, many Rishonim actually understand that Sheva Shabbosais Timimos Tiyena is not the mitzvah of counting weeks. It is simply saying, for 7 weeks you shall count 50 days. Or 49 days. In other words, Sheva Shabbos Tiyena is not referring to how you count. It's just telling you how long you count for. Meaning, the only thing the pasuk in Emor is talking about is the mitzvah of days, and the whole origin of weeks is from another pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. Now, if you learn that Parshas Emor is only creating the mitzvah of days and not weeks, then you can't go with Rabbeinu Yerucham, because whatever that pasuk is talking about is qualified with Miyom Haviachem Es Omer Hatnufa. So Rabbeinu Yerucham behechrech, according to this explanation, must understand that Sheva Shabbosais Timimos Tiyena is the mitzvah of counting weeks. That is the one that's qualified by Miyom Haviachem Es Omer Hatnufa, and the mitzvah of counting days is a standalone Tisperu Chamishim Yom. But again, you understand there are 2 ways of learning the pasuk, because in Parshas Re'eh there's a pasuk of weeks. Like Rabbeinu Yerucham, the emes is the pasuk in Re'eh is superfluous, because if you learn weeks and days from Parshas Emor, why does the Torah give me a pasuk about weeks in Parshas Re'eh? That's why many Rishonim understand that Parshas Emor only gives you days, and when it says Sheva Shabbosais, it is simply telling me for 7 weeks you count the days. But as I say, Rabbeinu Yerucham apparently does not learn that particular way. So that's the diuk. That is how the close reading of the pasuk could give rise to Rabbeinu Yerucham. But what you're still missing logic. Okay, you could read the pasuk to show that days are d'oraisa, even without the omer, and weeks are midrabanan, zecher lemikdash, and you could be medayik that way from the psukim. That's what we showed. But ultimately, what's the logic of it? Why should one part of the omer, the sphira, why should one part of the sphira be deoraisa today, and one part of the sphira be midrabanan today? Why do they fall apart in that way? So for a svara for this, a very excellent svara, we come to the familiar name, we come to the Ohr Somayach, we come to Rav Meir Simcha. Again, I'm sure you all know this, just to be sure everyone's on the same page. You ought to know the Ohr Somayach because you're in the yeshiva named after the Ohr Somayach. Rav Meir Simcha Kohen, the great Rav of Dvinsk in Latvia, died in the 1920s. One of the great Gedolim. So there are 2 svarim that he published. Actually, one was published in his lifetime, and one was not published till after his death. The sefer that was published in his lifetime is his monumental parish on the Rambam, that is called Ohr Somayach, after Meir Simcha, the Happy Light. And the sefer on Chumash, which was not published till after his death, is the Meshech Chochmah. So the Meshech Chochmah and the Ohr Somayach are the same person. They tell a little bit of a story why the Meshech Chochmah was not published in his lifetime. The Meshech Chochmah was actually completed before the Ohr Somayach was completed. But his father, who was still alive, told him that if you publish a sefer on Chumash first, you'll get a reputation as a darshan, someone who just gives drushes, and they're not going to respect your sefer on the Rambam because they figure if you're a darshan, you're not a lamdan or a real Talmid Chacham. So publish the lamdasha sefer first, and then they'll be makabel the chumash. Now the truth of the matter is, I don't know if that story is true at all, but the Meshech Chachma is not just a sefer of drush. The Meshech Chachma has a huge amount of lamdus and Kabbalah and philosophy and everything else. But nevertheless, people sometimes do judge a book by a cover. And when you see a book on Chumash, you struggle a little, another book on Chumash. Okay, Beseder. So his father tells him, publish a book on the Rambam. The story I heard, and again, this may be a legend. My Rosh Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael was Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman, Zechrono Livracha, first cousin of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, one of the great Talmidim of the Alter of Slobodka. And the one thing we knew about the Rosh Yeshiva from the time that I knew him, he was already in his 70s when I knew him, or late 60s maybe, was he had very bad eyesight. He had very bad eyesight. His glasses were 5 inches thick, and he was always looking really, really close. So the legend, the story that we have is that his vision became bad because when the Sefer Ohr Somayach came out, and the yeshivas didn't have copies, and no one had a copy, but he was able to borrow the Sefer for 1 or 2 nights. He spent 2 nights by the light of the moon reading through the whole Sefer Ohr Somayach, and the story goes that kind of ruined his vision. The truth is, I have some doubts about it. I don't doubt that he could read the Ohr Somayach in 2 days. That's not my doubt. But I don't think you get permanent eye damage by reading. It's like kind of the old thing that your mother told you. If you go swimming within a half an hour after you eat, you'll get a cramp and you'll die and you'll drown. That by and large, that is not true. And the idea that if you read by the dark, you're doing permanent damage to your eye is also not true. But nevertheless, this was the story that we were told in Yeshiva, that he spent 2 nights reading the Ohr Somayach cover to cover. Okay, but be it as may, in the Ohr Somayach, this is what he says as a hesber for Rabbeinu Yerucham. He says, the concept of Sfira is we're counting up to the holiday of Shavuos. We're counting the days, or the weeks, between Pesach and Shavuos. So he wants to say, why is there a chiyuv to count days and weeks? Because you're counting towards a holiday based on the units of the holiday. Now, how many days is the holiday of Shavuos? So the emes is, Shavuos has both a day holiday and Shavuos has a week holiday. How so? Shavuos as a Yom Tov is, of course, only 1 day. Okay, the Chutz La'aretz, it's 2 days because of calendrical doubt, but it's a 1-day holiday. But in the Beis HaMikdash, Shavuos, in a sense, was a week-long holiday because on all of the Shalosh Regalim, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, every male is mechuyev to bring an olas re'iyah, a burnt offering, and to physically come to the Azara, to the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. That's an olas re'iyah. Right? Every person. Yeira'eh kol zechorcha, v'lo yeira'eh panai rekam. Meaning every male must physically appear in the Azara and must bring his olas re'iyah. Now, let's take Pesach. You only have to bring 1 olas re'iyah. You can bring it the first day of Yom Tov, but if you didn't bring it on the first day of Yom Tov, you have 7 days to bring it, except on Shabbos. So the olas re'iyah of Pesach has 7 days. What about the olas re'iyah of Sukkos? So technically, it has 8 days, because although Shmini Atzeres is not part of Sukkos, and although Shmini Atzeres itself does not have its own olas re'iyah for a yachid, I mean, you have musaf, but nevertheless, legabe giving you the ability to make up your olas re'iyah, we count Shmini Atzeres, right, to give you that. So Pesach, we have 7 days. Sukkos, we have 8 days. Again, minus Shabbos. Shabbos you can't bring it. What about Shavuos? Now, logically, you might have thought that Shavuos should have 1 day. I got to bring my Olas Riyah on the Yom Tov. Shavuos is only a 1-day Yom Tov. But the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says the following. Since it says Shalosh Regalim, B'chag HaMatzos, B'chag HaShavuos, B'chag HaSukkos, we make a hekesh, we make a juxtaposition in which we compare Shavuos to the other holidays, just as the other holidays have at least 7 days to bring the Olas Riyah. Shavuos has 7 days. Now the Gemara then asks the Kasha, well, maybe Shavuos should have 8 days. Compare Shavuos to Sukkot. So the Gemara says, this is an example of the adage, Tafasta meruba loy tafasta, right? You try to hold on to too much, meaning like this. Pesach has 7. Sukkot has 8. Shavuos is either like Pesach or like Sukkot. I don't know. So I can only go with what I know for sure. I know for sure you have at least 7 days. Because whether I compare it to Pesach or Sukkot, I'm going to have 7 days. Elamai, maybe there's an 8th day because of Sukkot, but that you don't know, so you got to go with what is certain. So it turns out the following. It turns out that the Olas Re'iyah of Shavuos can be brought up to 6, not counting Shabbos, up to 6 days after Shavuos. You have Shavuos and another 6 days. So for purposes of Olas Re'iyah, not for purposes of Malacha, but for purposes of Olas Re'iyah, Shavuos is a 7-day Chag. Now the emes is, this concept of Shavuos as a 7-day Chag does survive even today, at least in some minhagim, including the minhag of Yerushalayim, and that is Tachanun. Normally, during the month of Nisan, we don't say Tachanun. During the month of Tishrei, we also, basically from Sukkot onwards, we don't say Tachanun because the month is already finished as a Yom Tov. But in terms of Yom Tov generally, you don't say Tachanun on a Yom Tov, of course, and you don't say Tachanun on Isru Chag, the day after a Yom Tov. Okay, that's true. So that would mean that I don't say Tachanun on the 6th of Sivan, and I don't say Tachanun on the 7th of Sivan. But once I'm past that, I should say Tachanun. Yeah? And yet, you will notice, and maybe you remember from last year, that we don't say Tachanun for 6 days after Shavuos. We don't say Tachanun for a week. Where does that come from? Answer, because Bizman HaMikdash, those 6 days had a festive aspect because they could be the days of Olas Re'iyah. Now there's a big machlokes in Chutz La'aretz. If you follow the minhag of a week, do you get an extra day? In other words, do you count Yom Tov Sheni and then add 6 days? Or not? So that's a machlokes if you get that extra day of not saying Tachanun in Chutz La'aretz. But be it as it may, not everybody has that minhag. According to the law of the Shulchan Aruch, you don't say Tachanun Isru Chag, and then you say Tachanun again. But the minhag Yerushalayim and the minhag of many people, even in Chutz La'aretz, is that they don't say Tachanun for the whole week. Okay, so now let's go back to the Ohr Somayach. So it turns out that Shavuos has both an aspect of a 1-day holiday and it has an aspect of a 7-day holiday. So says the Meshech Chochmah, the reason why you have to count in the Omer days and weeks is because since the Omer is a count up to the holiday of Shavuos, and Shavuos is both a day holiday and a week holiday, you have to count based on the nature of the holiday you're counting towards. So I count the days because Shavuos is a 1-day holiday. I count the weeks because Shavuos is a 1-week holiday. So says Rameir Simcha, If that's the case, Rabbeinu Yerucham could be very easily understood. Because the notion of Shavuos being a 1 week holiday, even though we have Tachanun, etc., but it's predominantly because of the Beis HaMikdash that you could bring the Olas Re'iyah for a week. After the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, we don't have the Olas Re'iyah that you're bringing for a week. So Shavuos is no longer actually a 1 week holiday. It is now only a 1 day holiday. And that's why the Yamim is the Oraisa, and the Shavuos is only going to be a Midrabanan, because we remember the Mikdash, and that's why we don't say Tachanun, etc. But intrinsically, there is no holiday for a week, because there's no Olas Re'iyah that you're going to bring during the week. This is Rav Meir Simcha's Hesber for Rabbeinu Yerucham, that the mitzvah of counting days and the mitzvah of counting weeks correlates to the different parts of the different aspects of the Yom Tov of Shavuos. It is interesting that the holiday itself is referred to by weeks, right? The word Shavuos is the holiday of weeks. You might have thought, let's call it the holiday of days. What's the holiday of weeks? But it could be, number one, besides the counting of weeks, which is the obvious reason why it's called Shavuos, but Shavuos has a double meaning. Shavuos also means oath, swearing. You take a Shavua. And therefore, the idea is that Matan Torah, we think about this, we took an oath to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In fact, Chazal use the Lashon all the time. Mushpa va'omed. Right? Let's say a person takes a Shavua not to do a mitzvah. Let's say a person is really angry and he makes a Shavua, I'm not going to eat matzah the first night of Pesach. And he swears by God's name. He takes a Shavua. He makes a Shavua, I'm not going to put on tefillin. I'm not going to say Shema. Now, violating a Shavua is a very, very serious Aveira. A very serious Aveira. So if, God forbid, a person made a Shavua that he's not going to do a mitzvah, should he violate his Shavua? Or should he not do the mitzvah and keep his Shavua? So the Gemara gives a very, very, the Mishnah gives a very straightforward answer. Any Shavua to violate the Torah is null and void. It doesn't have any effect at all. And the reason is because you're mushpa va'omed mehar Sinai. You've already taken an oath at Mount Sinai to keep the Torah. So you can't make a Shavua to contradict a Shavua you already made. Therefore, the halacha actually is, even if you made a Shavua with Hashem's name, that he's not going to wear tefillin, the halacha is he wears tefillin, and he's not guilty of violating his oath, but actually he is guilty of making an oath in vain. Since the oath is not valid, it's an oath in vain, he gets malchus for making an oath in vain. That's called a shvuas shav. Okay? So it might be, I'm just, again, speculating, that maybe the reason why the holiday got known as the holiday of weeks, as opposed to the holiday of days or whatever, is because the double meaning of Shavua, to remind us that Har Sinai were mushpa v'yomed. And that is why it is interesting too. Well, you can't really be medayek. There is a Maseches in the Gemara, Maseches Shavuos. Now, Maseches Shavuos is not about the holiday of Shavuos. Maseches Shavuos is about the laws of Shavua, oaths, right? All the dinim of Shavua. Nevertheless, it is interesting that Shavuos has 49 blot. So some have said it's a good minhag, a little too late now, I'm sorry I'm telling you now, that you learn Maseches Shavuos, 1 blot a day, for the duration of the counting of the Omer. So the answer might be, I want to learn about Shavuos, because Har Sinai is Shavuos. Now, L'maisa, I don't know if you could be medayek this way, because the number of dafim of a Masechta were totally a function of the printers of the Shas, meaning Chazal were not koveya. I mean, in manuscripts, you didn't necessarily have that number of dafim. That's why if you look at Rashi, for example, think about this. When Rashi or Tosfos refer to a Gemara somewhere, they do not tell you a daf. They tell you second parak of Shavuos. Now, somebody later added in parentheses, daf so-and-so. But in the original Rashi or Tosfos, it only referred you to the chapter. And the reason is very simple. Rashi and Tosfos, the Balei Tosfos, all lived before there was printing. Before there was printing, Svarim were manuscripts. Manuscripts didn't have any particular number of pages. If somebody wrote in big writing, there were more pages. If somebody wrote in small writing, there were less pages. There was not standardization. I mean, think about the difficulty the Rishonim had, even from a technical standpoint. There literally was not a standard pagination system. Pagination systems, daf so-and-so, were invented only with printing in the 1400s. And that is why the Rishonim always refer to passages in Shas by perek. That's the best I can tell you. It's in the perek somewhere. And then you got to look around till you find it. It is only with the advent of printing that we got standardization of pages. And remember that the original printers of Jewish books were actually Goyim, were Christians. I mean, Daniel Bomberg. I mean, the reason is, it's interesting. Yes, printing Jewish books was a very, very good way of making money, simply because 90% of Christians didn't know how to read. So to publish books for Christians, you didn't have a big market. Jews, Baruch Hashem, were literate, and therefore Jews would buy more books than Christians. So the early printers of Shas, of Rashi, of all of the Svarim from the manuscripts were Goyim. Bomberg was the most famous of them, but obviously they employed Jewish workers and Jewish rabbis to go over the manuscripts and the like and determine the pages. So in that sense, it's not clear to us if dafim are of any spiritual significance. Can you make a drush? On the other hand, it's probable, not probable, it's certain that every aspect of Torah has a certain element of hashgacha pratis. So even if Daniel Bomberg was the one who indicated how many pages, based on technical considerations, we have to say that min hashamayim, a certain decision was made. So in that way, Shavuos has the number of dafim equal to Matan Torah and the like. Okay, right. So I just wanted to go over the hesber of Rabbeinu Yerucham Lagabi the mitzvah of Svira. Now, once again, I'll talk about more of this tomorrow. But just to remind people, and we talked about this before in Sefer Yoshua, that the Korban HaOmer, when there was a Korban HaOmer, number one, like most Rishonim, it served as the Mechayev of Sfiras HaOmer, meaning there was no Chiyuv of counting the Omer unless there's a Korban Omer, and that's why it's only a Zecher B'Mikdash. But there's another function of the Korban HaOmer that's extremely important, and that is the bringing of the Korban HaOmer matired. It permitted, it enabled the consumption of the grain of the new year, right? There is an Isser in the Torah, and this is in Parshas Emor, again, called Chodosh, that when the grain grows, this refers to the Chamishas Minei Dagan. This refers to Chita, Saora, wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Right? The same thing that Hamotzi, Mazonos, Matzah, Chameshas Minei Dagan. So the Chameshas Minei Dagan have an Isser of Chadash. And you cannot eat Chadash until the Omer offering is brought. Okay? So the question is, what do we mean by Chadash? What do we mean by Yashan? So the Gemara in Menachos explains the following. Any grain that took root in the ground before the second day of Pesach, the bringing of the Omer will allow the consumption of that grain, even though it's not harvested until much later, because as long as it was rooted in the ground by the second day of Pesach, it is covered by the bringing of the Omer. Now, what do we mean rooted in the ground? So again, there's a machlokas, but the idea we paskin is that when you plant a seed, it takes generally around 2 weeks, according to Chazal, until it has roots in the ground. So that would mean, in other words, if you planted a grain 2 weeks or less, 2 weeks or more before Pesach, that grain would be mutter by the bringing of the Omer. So when it finally is harvested and comes to market, you can eat it because the Omer mattered that grain. Masha ein kain. If the grain did not root before Pesach, before the second day of Pesach, either because even though you planted it, you didn't have the 2 weeks, or you didn't plant it till after Pesach, that grain is not covered by the Omer. So that grain is called Chadash, and that's not going to be mutter to eat till next second, right? All Chadash eventually becomes Yashan. In other words, the grain that you plant after Pesach is not going to be permitted to eat until the bringing of next year's Omer. Because vis-a-vis next year's Omer, it is grain that predated Pesach. I mean, you understand the way it works, meaning anything that is Chadash vis-a-vis this Omer will become Yashan vis-a-vis next Omer. Okay, this is an Isser D'Oraisa. I'll talk tomorrow about how it works today. One is not allowed to eat the new grain of the Chamishas Minei Dagan until the Hakravas HaOmer on the second day of Pesach. The Omer matirs anything that was nishrash before the Hakravas HaOmer. The Omer does, and Kavacham if it was harvested already, and the Omer certainly matirs harvested grain, etc. But anything that did not reach the level of nishrash before the Hakravas HaOmer, and Kal V'chomer if it was planted after the Hakravas HaOmer, is a problem of Chadash and cannot be eaten until next year. So next year's Omer. So Hakravas HaOmer matirs the Yisr of Chadash. Yeah? So the two problems we're going to have is, number one, what happens today? How can you ever eat grain? We don't have an Omer offering that matirs the Chadash. So how does that work today? And number two, how does that work with respect to Chutz La'aretz grain? That's very important. Now we know that most agricultural mitzvahs, Trumos, Maisros, Shemitah, they do not apply to produce outside of Eretz Yisrael. These are what are called mitzvos tuluyos b'aretz. They're mitzvos that are connected to the growing of the ground. However, many opinions actually say that because the Torah describes in Parshas Emor the Yisr Chadash, b'chol moshvei seichem, wherever you live, that's the lashon, b'chol moshvei seichem, that's marbe even chutz la'aretz. So the question becomes whether there's a Chadash problem in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so we'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit. Okay, have a very good day.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.